Welcome everybody on the call today. Thank you so much for being here. We are excited to have you join us for the next webinar in our series, Technology for Human Behavior and Intervention Research. The topic today is maximizing participant engagement with your study app through user-centered design. And Anthony Levin-Decanini of Critical Studio will be our speaker. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section for Anthony to answer later on, but you can also ask questions as we go along. We have an interactive poll in the middle of the talk, so look out for that. And we are recording the webinar, so it'll be available on our website and in the follow-up email. So we'll get to the good stuff soon. I just wanted to quickly introduce New Realm. So as you can see, we've been around for a while. We do a lot of work with different industries, for-profits, nonprofits, entrepreneurs, and government agencies. But the majority of our work in the past 10 years has been with healthcare researchers. We consult as early as proposal writing all the way through the close of the study. We have clients who have been with us for many years, and we really love what we do. Next. So quick plug for our research software insight newsletter. You will, if you sign up for our monthly newsletter at newrealm.com/newsletter, you'll get monthly actionable guides on building digital interventions, passive sensing, study portals, but most importantly, very cute pet pics. So next. Here's an example of the adorable pet pics that you will receive in your inbox if you sign up for our newsletter. As you can see, these fur babies are from our developers, Haven and Ed. Got Helga and Bowie, and Binks is a ridiculously fluffy kitty who gets haircuts quarterly. So this is the type of content you'll receive if you sign up for our newsletter. All right, and next slide. And last plug will be for our next month's webinar. This is going to be with our friends Shift Collaborative. This webinar will focus on digital interfaces that communicate visually and verbally in a way that creates a connection with stakeholders, like your study participants, community, or colleagues. And so you can sign up for that on our website as well. Next. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Anthony, and Anthony has an incredible track record building digital products for social impact. We actually worked with him on a couple different features for the 412 Food Rescue app. He's the founder of Critical Studio and an adjunct professor of human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon University. So take it away, Anthony.
Thanks, Marina, and thanks to all of my friends at New Realm. Thanks to everybody for making time today for our session. So as Marina mentioned, my company is called Critical Studio. Like New Realm, we focus on kind of the non-commercial sector, really passionate about social impact. And so that work takes the form of building mobile and web applications, building data products like dashboards, and API-based products as well, and also some work around AI and emerging tech. I also have the advantage of being married to an academic researcher, so our topic today is near and dear to my heart as well. So thanks for joining us. And today I want to talk about why engagement matters, really. If you're in the process of conducting research, engagement is typically something that's thought of around, e-commerce and things like that, but it's actually sort of an important idea for you all to be thinking about. I'll give a little bit of a definition of user-centered design, really focusing on why it matters to people in your roles. And the bulk of my talk will really be about how user-centered design methods can help you achieve the results that you want to achieve as a researcher, and give you a little bit of a head start on trying out some of those methods. Of course, we'd love to partner with you on these things as well if you're interested in doing that. And throughout the talk, I'll give some real-world examples of how these methods have been used to create the products that you use every single day on your smartphone, on the web, etc. Of course, we'll have some time for Q&A, but if you have a burning question, feel free to throw it in the chat and we will get to it. So I'm sure you're aware of the fact that so many researchers are devoting time, energy, and funding to building their own mobile apps. And there are a lot of reasons why that's happening. Building an app in general is more accessible than it's ever been. There are so many great resources out there for learning to code. There are great tools that allow you to build things with low code and no code. And there are so many awesome partners that can help you through that process. So it's you're seeing a lot of folks take a stab at building their own app based on that. If you're a researcher, compared to the old-fashioned way of doing things, of course, this gives you a different kind of access to participants, hopefully in a way that is more cost-effective, more time-efficient for you in terms of managing the study as well. Obviously, with a mobile app, you have the ability to collect data in real time as well. So you can sort of peek in on that data as it rolls in and do interesting things with just looking at it longitudinally. And when it comes to that data, there are so many different dimensions of it that are possible. Of course, there's a greater volume that becomes accessible to you, but you're also able to collect different data. If you were able to tune into Sam's webinar recently about passive sensing, that's a great example of some data that becomes available to you in a mobile app setting that you might not have had access to before. And with that comes, of course, richer data. You're able to make correlations and do more interesting things with the data that you're able to collect. And through some simple sort of user interface methods, we're able to clean that data up on the front end as well to validate it and to make sure that you're getting data that's relevant to you and not just noise. Another great thing about mobile apps that you may or may not already be thinking about is, they give you the ability to adapt and respond to changing conditions. As things happen out in the world, as your population that's participating in your study adapts, you have the opportunity to release new versions of your app with additional features, with additional content, with things like that, that can be really useful as well. Here's an example of a study app. This is the Engaging Families app, and there was also a data portal that went along with this. This was developed by New Realm in partnership with researchers at Arizona State University. And this is sort of a supplement to an in-person parenting intervention. The idea here is to reinforce evidence-based effective parenting practices for parents of teens specifically. And by having this mobile app, it allows researchers to track all kinds of data in the web portal, things like the time that users are spending completing those practices and activities, the challenges that they're reporting that are getting in the way of applying those new skills, and the hacks that users select within the app to help them overcome those challenges as well. So enables them to really look at like what's being tried and what's working as folks are trying out some of those new techniques. Building something like this is significant, right? And again, I want to call back to an earlier webinar in the series. The first webinar in the series, Sam talked about kind of a high-level process for everything that's involved in funding, planning, and building an application like this. If you're looking for an overview of that process and a deeper understanding of what's really involved, I highly recommend you take a look at that as well. But my question for you is that what if you've gone through that process, you've done all of the funding and planning and development work, but what if at the end of that process, your study participants simply don't use the app that you've built? I guess another possibility would be that they maybe don't use it exactly the way that you intend for them to use it. And this is much more common with apps in general, but also with study apps than people probably realize. Much like our friend B Rabbit in 8 Mile, you might only get one shot. We know this is true because some studies would estimate that about a quarter of the mobile apps that get downloaded are never actually used by people. And another 20 to 25% of downloaded apps will only get used once and then deleted. So if a large percentage of your users are unlikely to engage to start with, how do we activate with those other folks? And if we don't make a connection in that very first session that people have with your app, you might lose their attention. And there are a lot of reasons why people don't engage. The first one is that they're not really sure how to get started. I'm sure we've all gone through sort of onboarding workflows that hold your hand and walk you through the steps of how to get started. And doing that effectively takes some time and some care to think through the questions that users are going to have and make sure that they get answered. A mistake that I see some folks make is that they don't take the time to build that kind of onboarding into a new application that they're building. They assume users are going to be able to figure it out, but it may not be as intuitive for them as the app creator thinks that it is. App users are likely to have data privacy concerns, especially if you're using passive sensing or you're asking them about really personal aspects of their life and their health. So you're going to want to think about addressing those concerns clearly up front in the experience and making sure that you're using plain language to answer those questions, not a lot of confusing jargon.
Anthony, on the topic of privacy and security, Maria has a question. She asks, does clean data mean it's clean security?
Good question. I think security is really a separate consideration in a lot of ways. The kind of data that I was talking about was, eliminating badly entered data, badly formatted data, making sure that, we're preventing, bots and automated responses from bad actors. So it's sort of related to security, but I think security is really kind of its own topic in and of itself.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so another reason that folks might not engage is if you haven't answered their questions. And if they, for instance, fear that, asking those kinds of questions might affect their ability to be compensated for participating in your study, then they might be reluctant to ask them in the first place. And it might be easier for them to just disengage. Of course, that's not what you're looking for as a researcher. So you want to address those questions. Accessibility is a huge thing that gets overlooked, especially by first-time app builders. It's highly likely that some of your participants have disabilities. 1 in 4 adults in the US lives with at least one disabilities. Many disabilities are not visible or apparent. And most of us will have a disability at some point during our life. So app creators need to really ask themselves whether what they've built is accessible to people. And that means supporting common assistive technologies like dictation, text-to-speech, magnification, resizing, assistive touch, et cetera. And this is a place where it's great to have a partner with a lot of expertise in that kind of technology along for the ride to help you work through those things. But the reality is that if people can't use your app because they need to rely on one of those assistive technologies and you simply don't support that, it's going to be easy for them to just simply delete it and not participate. what if your app just doesn't really seem that valuable to people? And that might be an impression that they have. It might be a wrong impression that they have, but you want to avoid them ever thinking about that in the first place. And the way that you do that is by showing clear benefits to them immediately. And again, even with paid participants, if they don't feel like the experience is going to benefit them directly, they may go away. Usability issues are another one. This is the ability to complete key tasks in your app. If users think that it's too hard to do that or that it takes too long to do that, it's not worth it to them, then they may disengage as well. And of course, many app creators think about the experience as kind of one and done. But if your experience is the same every single time users open up your app, there's a strong likelihood that they're going to lose interest over time. So thinking about how that experience plays out for them over the life cycle of your study is important as well. If you're asking your participants to do things like log events or enter data manually, it may be useful to make sure they don't forget. You can provide periodic reminders or gentle nudges, but doing this well, again, is another thing that requires some thoughtfulness and a bit of testing and tuning. And we're going to get into why those are important parts of user-centered design. So I want to ask you, of the folks that are here today, which barriers to participant engagement have you observed? We'll give you a minute or two to give us your answers. This is the
Anthony,
part. Go ahead.
I was going to say you'd said that you'd be humming the Jeopardy theme song at this
Right,
point,
right. Yeah.
so
Do, 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 do. That's about the best I can do.
good job.
Thanks. Can we get ChatGPT to whistle for us while we're doing this?
Who knows what? Oh gosh, that would be great. We do have a bunch of engagement here, so thank you everybody who's um, marking options.
I'm curious to see what the answers are.
It looks like lost interest over time is the biggest one right now. Yes, and I'll share it. We'll give everybody just a couple more seconds.
Yeah, so lost interest over time is a really interesting one because thinking about, for instance, I mentioned those nudges and how they kind of can play out over the course of a study is really complex and involves some sort of experimentation with what messages are going to resonate for people. But I think that's a really important part of doing this well and sort of driving engagement. Other ways of ensuring that people don't lose interest over time would be using sort of what we would refer to as out of band communications, where we might use email or even text messages to nudge folks to come back and try using the app again or to try logging an event. We might even consider using additional incentives to try to drive people back if they've lost interest. So yeah, there are a lot of levers to pull there, but I think that's a really interesting one. Usability issues, I think, is maybe the easiest one to solve. I will talk about usability testing in just a minute. This is an area I'm particularly passionate about and interested in because, and I think you'll all find that it's very similar to a lot of, scientific research. It follows a really similar methodology. Cool. Well, I'm going to
Cool.
keep going here. So obviously here to talk about user-centered design. You may have heard about human-centered design as well. I'm not sure that there's a huge distinction to make between those two terms, but it really is a matter of who we're focusing on. I think human-centered design tends to look at humans writ large and sort of how commonalities amongst us can be considered as part of the design process. But I think for you all who are creating, publishing research and running studies, it's important to think about who those participants are, and specifically the people that are using your app and how they are impacted by that, how they benefit from it. So I think it's important for you to know that user-centered design is a proven process. It's one that's been used to create just about all of the digital stuff and many of the physical things that you interact with in your day-to-day life. And there's a ton of data behind its effectiveness. It's really a pretty common practice in the commercial world. As I said, it's been used to build the most successful apps in the world, and I'll talk about a bunch of different examples today. But it's especially helpful for addressing that whole list of issues that we were just talking about, and in doing that, boosting engagement with your app as well. It's different from design processes that you might have encountered in other contexts, like in marketing, for instance, because we're not just looking at what it looks like. This is really not just about, whether the app that you're creating is beautiful or even whether it's well organized. We're maintaining our focus on the user's experience in interacting with that app. And it's really about behavior in that way. It also involves iteration. It's not some magic process where we kind of get it perfect the very first time. It involves making changes over time. It involves learning from the data that we're observing and the feedback that we're getting from users. And if you remember one of my favorite Saturday Night Live sketches from a long time ago, Phil Hartman is giving his performance as Charlton Heston in the cult classic Soylent Green. And he reminds us that Soylent Green is made of people. Just like Soylent Green, user-centered design is really about people. We create experiences. And oftentimes people think of their app as being very technical. It's all about the code. But it's really about people's understanding. It's about their feelings. It's about the behaviors that they undertake while they're using those things. So user-centered design is about making sure we keep people front and center throughout the process. So the question then becomes, how does user-centered design help drive deeper and more authentic engagement? I'm going to walk through some methods, and the good news is that these will probably feel pretty familiar to you as researchers. As I mentioned, they're drawn from methods used by social scientists. And since we care about people's engagement, we're really thinking about human behavior first and foremost. So one way that user-centered design can drive engagement is by understanding people's real needs. The simplest way to understand what people really need is by asking them through direct dialogue. User interviews help us sort of check our own biases and preconceptions as we go through that process. By asking questions carefully, we can understand people's view of the world and their goals, their why they want to use this app. And we know what we want the product to do, but what are their desires, and where can those two things meet in the middle to create value for the researcher and for the participant? A great example of how user interviews have been used is Instagram. You may not already know this, but Instagram was originally started as a check-in app called Bourbon. And there were a million different features in it. And through conducting interviews with users who were engaging with the app, the founders discovered that the thing people were most interested in this large set of features was filtering their photos and sharing them. So they pivoted and they began to focus on that feature based on those user interviews. And today they have 2.4 billion users. So it turns out that listening to people can be really, really valuable. Another way that user-centered design can create engagement is by considering how your app fits into people's lives. A lot of app creators feel like if they build it, they will come, but that's not necessarily the case. We would use a method like contextual inquiry, which is a type of field study, so that we can observe users in their natural environment, which is really when and how they use your app. And this often differs from what app creators expect, or even from what app users tell you about their context of use. So this allows us to actually get to their real context of use and understand how that influences the design. Are they using it at home? Are they using it on the bus on the way to work? What else is going on for them in that moment? So in that unique context, they have real limitations and they're bringing specific knowledge to bear, and all of those things sort of have a heavy impact on whether they're going to be able to engage with the app. Great example of this is the $300 million button. This is sort of a famous story in user experience design circles, so forgive me if you've heard this one before, but back in the mid-2000s, a large retailer noticed a problem that they were having with their e-commerce site. And through this method of contextual inquiry, literally observing users while they were checking out, in the shopping site, they noticed that a lot of people were really struggling on this screen. And in looking at the site analytics, they found that about 40% of people were getting stuck here because they needed to either log in or create a new account. And they found out that through contextual inquiry that people were busy in that moment. They didn't want to create an account, and maybe if they had created an account in the past, they might not remember the password. And so if they got stuck in this moment, they were very likely to just simply abandon. Now, something like guest checkout, an improvement that they were able to add in this moment, is a really standard feature today, but at the time it was a pretty new idea. Adding that guest checkout based on what they learned in contextual inquiry allowed them to see a $300 million increase in revenue because users were not abandoning their carts in that moment. Now, obviously, the folks on this call are probably not building e-commerce brands, but and obviously guest checkout is not a feature that's relevant to your study, but understanding how people's lives, how your app fits into their lives is very often fruitful in ways you didn't expect and unlocks new possibilities. When we design with purpose, we are going to be able to take advantage of familiar patterns and design metaphors that are more successful. We use a method called design systems to help us do this. And so we will have a system of components that are designed to work together. And they're based on those guiding principles of interaction design, or what we would call heuristics. And This allows us to make things which are predictable, understandable, and familiar to users. And in doing that, that gives the users confidence that they understand how this thing works. It's not a new thing that they need to figure out. And confidence is one of the biggest drivers of engagement. If people feel confident that they understand what to do with your app, they're much more likely to spend time with it. So if you have an iPhone in your pocket, you've experienced how design systems are applied just about every single day. You know that these components that you see in all the different applications that you use on your iPhone have a familiar design language. They have familiar interaction patterns. They have the same color scheme and the same type treatments. So over time, those sort of things become wallpaper to you. You don't even notice them anymore because you're so familiar with how to interact with them. And if that is the case with your study app as well, then people are going to be much more likely to complete the tasks that you want them to complete with the app. Android's got a similar thing. Theirs is called material design. Obviously, slightly different design language, different look, different feel, different sort of actions and micro interactions that happen within it, but same principle. Thinking systematically across the whole experience that users have. And obviously, again, just like with building an e-commerce site, obviously you're not in the business of building an operating system for a phone, but delivering a consistent experience by using a design system always helps boost engagement, no matter what you're building. I mentioned this one a little earlier, but we can increase engagement by optimizing our app, and we use a method called usability testing to really drive that. So you're probably not going to design your app perfectly the very first time, but that's okay. Through prototyping and usability testing, you can quickly learn what's working and improve the overall experience for people. For my money, usability testing is the single most valuable design method that we have. It allows us to evaluate a design cheaply, efficiently, and it just has massive amounts of value. Here's how we typically do it. We would create a clickable prototype, and here's an example of one of those clickable prototypes. We would use a tool like Figma in this case to quickly put something together that's really just a picture of a test run of the experience that we expect users to have. And we can do this without writing any code, and it looks very realistic. So users are able to interact with this, and it feels like they're using the real app. So we can round up some representative users and ask them to do some of the key tasks with this app, and we can observe them while they're doing that. We can collect all kinds of data while they're doing that, things like whether they can complete those tasks, the time it takes them to do that, the issues they encounter along the way, and their satisfaction level at the end of the process. All of that helps us understand what's working and what's not, and we can iterate on the design from there. Of course, this is probably an extremely familiar model to you as researchers. We're gathering data. We're not just asking people for opinions or asserting our own opinions. We're observing behavior. We're not just making assumptions about what that behavior is going to be, and we're trying to control for bias throughout that process. A great example of how optimization and usability testing are used is Duolingo. So if you're a user, as many of you probably are, you know that Duolingo's whole mission is to get you coming back day after day to continue your language learning journey. And so they're heavily invested in thinking about the psychology of that experience and what little nudges are going to make you feel invested and help you complete your tasks, like coming back and learning every day. A thing you might not know is that apps like Duolingo might have hundreds of different experiments running in the production app at any given time. And they might have lots of little variations of different features that are being shown to small percentages of users. And once they are able to gather quantitative and qualitative data about those features, then they're able to make decisions about whether to release them to increasingly wider sets of users to try to drive the outcomes for the business. So those same principles can be employed in your study app as well to learn what's working and what's not, and again, sort of iterate over time. I know it's seductive to want to just jump right in if you're thinking about building a study app. I mentioned how accessible it is, and simply putting something in the App Store is relatively easy these days. But I think it's important to think about this principle from construction. A lot of folks in my family work in construction. They say it all the time: measure twice, cut once. It can be expensive to write code. It can be expensive to spend a lot of time raising money and planning an app like this. User-centered design is really important to help you make sure that you're putting something out into the world which has a higher chance of engaging your users and resulting in getting you the quantity and quality of data that you need to move your research forward. And with that, we'll go to Q&A.
Okay, we do have one question queued up. So we have an anonymous question. What's the difference between a focus group and user testing, and why might you suggest deviating from focus groups?
Yeah, great question. So when I hear focus groups, I think about the comedy show, I Think You Should Leave, and Tim Robinson's character running a focus group where a guy keeps asking for a good steering wheel that doesn't fly off while you're driving. Focus groups are really about getting opinions from people about whether they like or dislike something. That's very different from gathering data about people's behaviors and whether your application is successful in helping them achieve their goals, whether it's successful in helping you gather the data that you need, whether it's efficient for people to use. So usability testing and iteration are quite different from what you might learn from a focus group. People might love or hate your app, but that doesn't necessarily tell you whether your app is going to be successful in completing tasks, gathering data, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's important to look at the outcomes and gather that data rather than just ask for opinions. If it were a matter of just asking for opinions, you could show it to your barber and your next door neighbor and know whether your app was going to be successful.
Okay, we have, let's see. What are your thoughts on somehow creating community among users who might be somehow vulnerable, like children, etc.? This seems to be a key element of engagement, but it's so hard to do in studies.
Yes, absolutely. And so you'll see in the commercial world, in healthcare specifically, you'll see, investment in those communities. I used to work for American Eagle Outfitters, and I know as a company there, we invested a lot in community moderation, developing communities, and saw a huge sort of payoff in doing that. So yes, absolutely. I think that falls under that category of sort of like out of band communication that can drive people back to participate in using an app. It can make people feel affinity with whatever subject matter you're dealing with, and certainly in sort of a support setting that can be absolutely critical to health outcomes and self-esteem and so many other things. So yes, I think that is actually a super valuable way of driving engagement as well. The hard part is, how do you connect it back to the sort of core experience that you want or need users to have with something like a study app. And so that connective tissue between those two things is something that needs to be considered and designed as well.
All right, so we got a couple more questions. So Kendra asks, can you say more about using Figma to help with a usability study? Is there a guide for what to measure using this method?
Great question. So I have been doing usability studies for a decade before Figma ever existed. So I don't think Figma itself is a critical component of usability testing. I think Figma is a great way to build a prototype fairly quickly. As far as what data to collect, I think I mentioned a few points there that I think are useful. Task completion is always the most important sort of primary thing to be testing for. And in order to test task completion, you need to know what the most important tasks are with a given app. So you need to think through what do we need users to do and how do we define success in that task? What page do they need to get to, or what button do they need to click, or what data do they need to enter in order for us to say definitively they've completed that task. Time on task is another one. If we need them to be able to complete things efficiently, then how long is an appropriate amount of time for them to spend every time they need to log an event or something like that? Error rate would be another one, like what percentage of your users or how frequently are they getting stuck or sidetracked while they're trying to complete a task that they care about. I mentioned the satisfaction rating. We can ask users about their satisfaction rating at the completion of a task. You could also look up the system usability score, which is another quantitative measure of usability. There are tons of these metrics. Frankly, I'm not sure that all of them are really super useful for this context. And I think doing the basics of usability testing well are actually quite simple and have massive payoff for folks that invest time in doing it.
Great. We have one more question if you
Sure.
oh, actually there are two more. So if we don't get to them, they can be answered via email later. So let's see here. What strategies have you found to be most helpful for getting people to initiate app use and then sustain app use?
Great question. Sustain app use is easy. They need to find value in using it. So they need to get a payoff from using it. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a financial payoff. There could be some psychological benefit. There could be an emotional benefit, a feeling of connectedness. It could be that the app's providing them with information or strategies that are useful to them. But I think keeping people engaged is all about value. It's about making sure that that it continues to deliver for them. And that's why that sort of changing over time and adapting to them and becoming more personalized, that strategy can be really useful because you're not just sort of serving up the same things to them over and over again. As far as initially getting them started, I think it's also related to value. They need to perceive that there is something valuable for them in downloading that app. I think having a community of folks using it, that social proof can be quite convincing to people to hear that other people are experiencing value from that app. I think, having it come from a reputable source like a university or a subject matter expert can make them very curious about trying it out as well. So making sure that that information is prominent and clear for them to understand.
Okay, I just got the go ahead that we could go a little bit over if that's okay
Okay,
with you, because there are more
sure,
questions. Okay,
sure,
great.
yeah, yeah.
So Joanna, this is very interesting. How do you balance usability across two iOS and Android with cost? Sorry, how do you balance usability across iOS and Android with cost? Is the most engaging strategy to essentially have a fair amount of divergence to be consistent with the OS native settings / user expectations?
That is a good question. I think one solution that's a technical solution to this problem would be to use a hybrid framework, which would allow you to code a single web application that is then published for both Android and iOS users, rather than building separate native apps for both iOS and Android. Now, in doing that, you give up the advantage of working within the native OS design language, but the World Wide Web is great evidence to the fact that you don't necessarily have to stick rigidly to that native design language in order to be successful. It's just important that your design language is usable for people and accessible to them. So that's one possible workaround to that problem. I think you're going to see over time that those design systems, iOS and Android specifically, like are probably going to continue converging more and more over time. I think you can also take a look at where your user base is. I think for a lot of applications, the sad truth is that most of their users are iOS users. So at some point, you have to ask yourself, how much energy is it worth expending to support the platform that represents a very tiny percentage of your user base? And I've seen the opposite as well. I've seen user bases that are 90% Android. And the question was, is it worth it for us to keep building an iOS app? So all of those are ways to start thinking about that problem. But I think it is an interesting one, and one that you can work through with an engineering partner, certainly.
Right. So, next question, are there any online tools you think are effective for doing user testing, or is in-person still the best way to do it? It seems hard to get people together for user testing, so just wondering if there's easier ways that still work.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that work. So these days, I think you'll see that in the commercial world, most usability testing is being done remotely. And that can be done in a moderated or unmoderated way. There are unmoderated tools that we use, ones like Maze, which allow us to sort of set up tests that prompt users with tasks and evaluate whether they've completed them or not, that are fairly decent. My personal preference would be to do moderated usability testing, and that doesn't have to be done in person. It can be done remotely as well, using simple tools like Zoom. There are lots and lots of tools out there. I would say that the important thing about usability testing is more about method than it is about tool. It's most important that you're sort of being thoughtful about the way that you're doing it, and that you're having conversations with people as much as you can.
All right, one last one. Um, Maybe a silly question. How much does it cost to do user-centered design right versus not doing much? And in parentheses, maybe you'll say it costs more in the long run not to do it.
You maybe read my mind. So I think be happy to talk to you more about that offline. Of course, it's hard for me to give you hard numbers about the differences
Mhm.
in costs, but I have certainly seen lots of clients spend a lot of money to build the wrong thing and regret it later, right? And so, on that mindset of measure twice, cut once, um, although it might seem like a larger outlay of costs at the beginning of a project to invest in user-centered design, for many folks, that cost pales in comparison to the cost of not getting the data that you need, not getting the engagement that you need, not having users, invested in the things that you've built. So it is certainly a cost benefit analysis, and there are certainly lightweight things that can be done to give you some user-centered design without a drawn out process per se. So I think it's worth a conversation to sort of right size that for you. I'm certainly not someone who would say that you either do 6 months of design or you don't do design at all. I certainly think there's a ton of benefit that can be had by doing really just a little bit of thoughtful design, if that's all that's possible in a given timeline or budget.
Great answer. All right. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. So thank you all for joining. Of course, if you would like to partner with Critical Studio and New Realm on a project, reach out to us at info@newrealm.com. There's a survey at the end that will pop up. If you just take a second to let us know where you're coming from. There will be a recording of this sent out. So thank you, Anthony, and thanks for everybody for your questions, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, folks.